point. And if you see the moment arm in cos theta. So the total moment therefore is going to be m omega square L square sin theta cos theta. That's going to be the moment due to centrifugal force. Okay. Now, account. If you were to simply come rate of change of angular momentum, see omega z cross times I naught omega z. You know, is in the class. It's simply given by I0z minus I0x times omega z square sin theta cos theta. Okay. Now,
Sir.
what is I0z and I0x? Hello?
Yes, sir. This is about the oh, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes. So I0z minus I equal to. Am I audible? Dinesh?
Sir, your voice is cutting, sir. Yeah, you are
Hello?
audible, sir. Hello?
Yeah. Well, let me just give the gist of this. Okay. So if you take the difference between these two, you will have to apply parallel axis theorem to obtain the result. And if you do that, you're going to get the exact same expression for rate of change of angular momentum as what you got when you assume centrifugal force to exist. Okay.
Okay, sir. I think we have taken this inertia matrix about this O axis, no, sir. That's yes, sir. That have included the centrifugal force.
Exactly.
I think that's okay. Okay, sir.
Exactly.
Got it. Sir, I have another doubt,
So
sir.
there's another reason also. No, wait
Yeah.
a minute. Let me complete this.
Okay,
So
sir.
there is a difference between representing a vector reference frame, whether that even if the frame is a rotating reference frame, and writing down the equations of motion in a rotating reference frame. When you write down the equations of motion in a rotating reference frame, you are talking about a reference frame which is non-inertial. Okay, so then in reference frame, centrifugal force and other things need to be brought into the picture. Here, what we are doing is not that. What we are doing instead is we are just representing the vectors, angular momentum vector, angular velocity vector, everything body fixed frame. Only resolving, okay, is a difference here. For the simple reason that you are not reference frame. You are writing the equation of in the inertial reference frame, but taking its components in the rotating reference.
Yeah, yes.
That's
yes, sir. Got
resolving
it, sir.
the components of the vector in the okay, then supervision. After I answer his question, yeah, Subhadeep, you had a question. Kindly go ahead.
Yes, sir. Sir, am I audible?
Huh.
Yes, sir.
You're audible. Yes. Am I audible too?
Yes, sir. Sir, I have a question regarding the previous class, that is lecture 15. That at the end of the class, you have just shown the how to calculate the forces of constraint. So, sir, I could not understand what is actually the forces of constraint. That one, sir.
What do you mean by forces of constraint? Is it?
Yes, sir.
Is that your question?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So there is a certain geometric constraint that that distance from that point of rotation is always in case of the mass that is moving in the horizontal plane, it has to move in such a manner the horizontal does not leave the horizontal plane. It neither enters
Sir, your voice is
into
not
the
clear.
ground or leaves the ground. Well, I don't know what to do. Let me try to. Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Sir, in between for 3-4 seconds it's cutting and then again.
Let me try again.
Sir, your voice is fluctuating a lot today.
I don't know why, Yogesh. I'll try to connect the LAN cable and see if that improves matters.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
I will log off and log back in. Okay.
Yeah.
Yogesh, can you hear me?
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay, good. I just checked my.
Yes.
But
Hello. Am I audible now, Yogesh? Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, yeah. Now it's fine, I guess.
Okay, okay. So Subhadip had this question about constraint forces and what they mean. So I think let us get started with today's class anyway, because as part of the recap, Subhadip, I will anyway talk about constraint forces. Okay. Rather than answer your question separately, I shall include my answer in the recap.
Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just try to share the screen. Just a moment. Can you guys now see my screen? Can you see the white sheet of paper that I have here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So let us get started. Just a moment. Yeah. So we will continue our discussion on Lagrangian formalism. Okay. And today we would focus on multi-body dynamics. Okay. So this was actually the motivation, right, for us to get started with Lagrangian formalism. The reason we started looking for alternate ways to write down the obtain the equations of motion for a multi-body system was because of the opacity and the complexity associated with Newton-Euler formulation. So hopefully we will have a satisfactory closure to that quest in today's lecture. In the previous two lectures, we looked at the machinery of Lagrangian formalism, what generalized forces are, what holonomic constraints are, what generalized coordinates are, what constraint forces are, and so on and so forth. So rather than deriving all of these definitions from first principles to underscore their significance, we instead assumed that they were significant and just defined them at the outset, and subsequently went about applying them to various problems. Okay, so I'll just write down what we discussed in the previous lecture. So first we introduced the notion of a generalized force. Okay, and the generalized force was based on the notion of virtual work, right? So generalized force associated with a certain generalized coordinate was that quantity which ended up doing the same amount of virtual work upon providing a virtual displacement to that generalized coordinate as the other forces and moments that the physical system is actually experiencing. So one important point that we made in that connection, therefore, was that it does not need to have the same units as Newton. And the other point that we noticed was in the case of, for example, the 4-bar mechanism, it need not even be applied. I don't know. It need not even be applied at that particular joint where we are defining this generalized coordinate. Often generalized coordinates are relative angular positions or relative displacements of one link with respect to another. So the generalized force could have contributions from other forces also, which are not acting at that particular link, and that's because anything that ends up doing virtual work when this particular generalized coordinate is changed is going to end up contributing to the definition of a generalized force. So does not need to act at the same joint for which the generalized coordinate is a joint variable. Right? So before all of this, let me just add one more point. It's based on the principle of virtual work. Okay, then we as we have done in the past, we took any number of examples to illustrate how we can determine generalized forces for various systems. Okay, so examples for calculating generalized forces were presented. Okay, then the third aspect that we discussed was this notion of a constraint force. So one of the attractions of Lagrangian formalism is that it doesn't require you to estimate internal forces, okay, of a mechanism. So something that imposes certain constraints need not be considered in some circumstances, at least. For example, in the case of serial kinematic manipulators, it's not necessary to consider them, and we can directly obtain the equations of motion that relate the joint variables, which will be the generalized coordinates, to the joint torque. But occasionally we would be interested to know these internal forces. Okay, likewise in parallel kinematic mechanisms, there will already be some kinematic constraints that will have to be satisfied, so that is unavoidable. And there will have to therefore be forces, generalized forces, that impose those kinematic constraints, and these are called forces of constraint or constraint forces. So there is usually an algebraic equation in case of holonomic constraints which needs to be satisfied by the chosen generalized coordinates, right? So in case of, for example, the pendulum, if I were to choose the length and the angle, length of the pendulum and the angle of the pendulum away from the vertical to be the two generalized coordinates, then that length of the pendulum has to be kept a constant, right? So that does not change as the pendulum moves about. So that is one equation. That's a geometric equation, that length L is a constant. Now there has to be a force that is applied on that moving object, which ensures that the length L is a constant at all times. So such a force is a constraint force in that particular system. So likewise, if we take the case of that mass that we consider it was sliding on the horizontal floor, there has to be a force that ensures that the mass stays put on the horizontal floor. It doesn't enter into the horizontal floor or move away above the horizontal floor. So that again is a constraint force. So equation of constraint, the geometric equation of constraint there is that y is equal to 0, where y is the vertical coordinate of that center of that object or center of that mass that is moving in the horizontal direction. Okay, so there are all these in case of holonomic constraints, there are all these algebraic equations that these generalized coordinates satisfy. But how do they end up satisfying them? It's because there are certain forces that are acting on the system which ensure that these constraints are met, and such forces are called as constraint forces. Okay, so there are geometric constraints, okay, which can be written as f of q1, q2, etc., comma time is equal to 0. So by definition, such constraints which can be written in this form are called holonomic constraints. And how do we ensure that these holonomic constraints are met? It's because there are constraint forces acting all the time that ensure that these are met. Okay, so how do we go about obtaining the constraint forces? I provided the steps in the previous lecture, but I will add 2 more steps to whatever I provided, because that was not clear in the description that I had. So first, assume that the constraints do not exist. The first step, do not exist. Then the second step is write down the Lagrangian okay, assuming that the constraints do not exist. So I don't need to repeat it, but nevertheless, given its significance, I will do it. Assuming that the constraints do not exist. Okay, then the third point is the first step that I wrote in the previous lecture, namely to introduce a new Lagrangian L prime, which is equal to L plus lambda f, where f is equal to 0 is the constraint that our system has, and lambda was called as a Lagrange multiplier, and then we treat lambda as another generalized coordinate. Write down the Euler-Lagrange equations for that also. So once we do this, the expression that we get for lambda will help us obtain the constraint force. So the constraint force along the ith generalized coordinate fi is let me use some other symbol here, capital F as a constraint, or maybe capital Q. Oh no, Q we use for generalized force, maybe capital F itself I will use. Okay, Fi is equal to lambda partial derivative of F with respect to that particular generalized coordinate. Okay, so if you have multiple constraints, this was something that we did not talk about in the previous lecture, then we replace the Lagrangian with L prime equal to L plus lambda 1 f1 plus lambda 2 f2, etc., up to lambda n fn. Okay, so this will be the if you have n constraints, f1, f2, f3 up to fn, then this is how it's going to look, and the joint force Fi will be equal to sigma lambda. Let me put this as lambda j delta fj by delta qi. Okay, So that's going to be the constraint force associated with the ith generalized coordinate. Okay, we will not be using too much of this, but I just wanted to put it out there. Okay, so Subhadeep, I hope this answered your question as to what constraint forces are. They are those forces that enforce these geometric constraints would be met. Okay, and we looked at several different geometric constraints. We took the case of the pendulum, which was swinging up at a certain point. We took the case of a pendulum whose revolute joint was moving, accelerating along the x-axis, accelerating along the z-axis. We took the case of the block sitting on a floor. In all these cases, a certain geometric constraint is met, and the force that enforces that constraint is, by definition, the constraint force. Okay. So, having seen several of these problems, having solved several examples to get a feel for how one applies all these tools, what we can take away from this approach is that, compared to, for example, the Newton-Euler technique, is that you can divide up the approach into two parts. Okay, the first part is the physics part. Okay, where you need to understand the kinematics of your mechanism of your chain, of your system of particles or rigid bodies or whatever, and then write down the Lagrangian for that. And that requires you to understand the kinematics, because you need to know the velocities of different elements in your kinematic chain, right? So that requires you to understand. Let me put it here. So there's a physics half and a mathematics half to solving the problem. The physics half involves obtaining Lagrangian T minus V. Okay, that's one part. Another part of the physics under the physics half involves obtaining the constraints. Okay, constraint equations. This too is specific to the problem that we are considering. So, for example, if you have a rolling cylinder, there will be a certain constraint equation relating the angle of that rotating cylinder to the displacement. If you have a pendulum, you have a certain constraint equation specifying its length to be a constant or whatever else. So that's also dependent on the physics of the problem. And the third thing are the generalized forces. Even obtaining generalized forces requires you to understand the kinematics of your mechanism. Okay. After these three are done, then what follows is just a lot of algebra. Okay. If you know your 12th standard calculus on how to take partial derivatives, how to take derivatives with respect to time and so on, you simply have to blindly do all of those in order to get the answer, in order to directly get the dynamics of your multi-body system. Okay, so the mathematics half involves solving, computing this delta qi dot minus delta L by delta qi is equal to capital Qi. So you have already computed capital Qi as under the physics half. You have already computed Lagrangian again under the physics half, and then you would be solving this equation. If you have constraints, of course, you would define a new Lagrangian, which is L prime is equal to L plus lambda f, and constraint equations f would be defined under the physics half, and then with this new Lagrangian, you would essentially push this new Lagrangian through the same machinery as what we have here, and lo and behold, you would obtain the equations of motion. How does this compare with the Newton-Euler formulation? So this is a Lagrangian formulation, right? Newton-Euler formulation. So in Newton-Euler formulation, you see, at least the way we have done it so far, that recursive equations that we wrote, we did not bring in the mathematics at all. It was physics all the way. So we took, we spent quite a bit of time in forward recursion. So forward recursion to obtain the angular velocities and linear velocities of the next link, given those of the previous link, and so on. And then there was backward recursion to obtain the joint forces. And that was it. Okay. So we just wrote down the free body diagram for every single mass, and then we expressed the velocities and angular velocities and accelerations in the coordinate frame attached to that particular mass, and then we wrote down the Newton-Euler equations and we left it at that. We were so tired at the end of doing only just that we did not have the energy to plow through the mathematics and solve those, simplify those equations, get rid of the reaction forces, etc., and obtain an equation that directly relates the joint variables and the rates of change with respect to time to the joint torques and such other things. Okay, so if you compare these two, therefore, this mathematics half could be contemplated in this case because of the simplicity associated with the physics half. In Newton-Euler formulation, the physics half itself was so time-consuming and tiring. Right? We covered pages upon pages with recursive expressions for angular velocity, acceleration, force, etc., etc. We did not have any energy remaining to once again go back to these recursive expressions and eliminate the unnecessary variables. Okay, so this, on the other hand, gives us that flexibility. Allows us to directly obtain the equations of motion. Okay, so with just that small comparison between Newton-Euler and Lagrange, let us now proceed to obtaining the equations of motion for multi-body systems. Okay, so the first thing we need to do in this connection is to obtain the kinetic energy of a rigid body. See, if you want to write down the Lagrangian for a rigid body, it is Lagrangian for a rigid body. Okay, what is the Lagrangian for a rigid body? The definition is the same. Kinetic energy of the rigid body minus potential energy of the rigid body. And if the rigid body is in a gravitational field, the potential energy can be completely captured by the height of that center of mass of that rigid body above the datum that you have picked, above the ground. Right? So this potential energy term is fairly straightforward. You can treat that rigid body as a point mass which is situated at the center of mass of that rigid body, and then the height of that point mass above the ground will give you the potential energy of that rigid body. So there is no ambiguity, no extra calculations or formulae are needed for computing the potential energy of the rigid body. Right? What about the kinetic energy? A rigid body not only undergoes translation but also undergoes rotation. Right? So we have to therefore take into account the energy associated with rotational motion of a rigid body as well when we compute the kinetic energy. So let us first briefly do that before we write down the Lagrangian for a rigid body. I'll take a specific example, write down the Lagrangian and solve some more problems. Okay, any questions so far? Okay,
sir.
Yes,
sir, actually I'm going to out because my eyes are paining too much today, sir. Too much actually. I'm not able to see.
Yeah, it's up to you, Dinesh. You don't need to.
I will see later, sir.
So,
okay, I'm sorry, sir. I'm going to.
Yeah, thank you. It's all right. Yeah, bye.
Okay.
So take care of your health. Bye.
Okay.
Yeah. So, just a moment. How do we express the total energy of a rigid body in terms of the angular velocity it has and the linear velocity it has? So let us write down a schematic of a rigid body. This is the rigid body, an irregular potato, and we have a coordinate frame xb, yb, zb attached to it. Okay, so let us say this is attached to the center of mass itself for the sake of simplicity. Okay, what is the definition of the kinetic energy of any body, right? If I consider an elemental mass dm here, okay, at some position p with respect to the inertial coordinate system, okay, then p dot will be the velocity of that mass dm. So the magnitude of that velocity square times that mass times half is the kinetic energy of the tiny mass, right? So what is the total kinetic energy of this composition of masses? It's just going to be integral of this over the entire volume of that rigid body. Okay, notice that I have not represented, I have not taken care to represent P dot in either A or the B frames, because it really in A or the B frames, because it doesn't really matter, right? We notice that even if the representation of a vector were to change, the magnitude of the vector doesn't change when you represent it in a different coordinate system, right? So whether we represent P dot in the A coordinate system or P dot in the B coordinate system, we are going to get the same expression. So this is going to be equal to half integral over volume P dot represented in the A coordinate system square dm, which in turn is going to be equal to half integral over volume half P dot represented in the B coordinate system square dm, right? So now we represent, so instead of carrying the superscript A or B, for the sake of simplicity, I will drop that superscript because the kinetic energy is independent of the superscript. Okay, so this is simply half magnitude of P dot square dm. Okay, and the magnitude of P dot, if you recollect, is nothing but P dot transpose P dot. Okay, a dot product of a vector with itself is equal to the sum of the squares of its individual components, right? So that is going to be therefore equal to the kinetic energy. Any questions about this? Okay, now any general point P, we shall write it as the center of mass plus rho, exactly as we did in some of the previous analyses. We shall represent the velocity of that point P in terms of the velocity of the center of mass. So to do that, we start by representing the position of that point as a PG plus rho. Okay, I have indicated PG to be the vector from the origin of the A frame to the origin of that B frame, and rho is that vector relative position vector of that mass dm with respect to the origin of the B frame. So we would therefore have that P dot is equal to PG dot plus rho dot, right? So we would therefore have the kinetic energy. There's a lot of algebra. I will not do it completely because similar algebra has been carried out by us in the past. It will be equal to PG dot plus rho dot transpose times PG dot plus rho dot dm. Okay, which will be equal to half integral PG dot transpose PG dot dm plus integral rho dot transpose PG dot dm plus integral PG dot transpose rho dot dm plus integral rho dot transpose rho dot dm. Okay, this half applies to everything. Just expanded this thing out. Now for a rigid body, we know that rho dot is equal to omega cross rho, right? And we also know that integral rho dm is equal to 0 over the integrated over the volume of the object by definition. As a consequence of these facts, we have used this earlier in the past when we were trying to obtain the Newton-Euler's equations. You will notice that these two terms here will go to 0 because I can write rho dot as omega cross rho, and then I can do some manipulation very similar to what I did for when I was deriving the Newton-Euler's equations, and they will go to 0. As a consequence, I will have the kinetic energy to be equal to half of integral PG dot dot transpose PG dot dm, okay, plus half integral rho dot transpose rho dot dm. I'll just expand that out. It's omega cross rho transpose times omega cross rho dm. Okay, so let us look at the first term. So PG dot transpose PG dot has no spatial dependence. Okay, it only has temporal dependence. So I can remove it from the integral, and I'll just get this to be half of the total mass times the center of velocity of the center of mass, VCM, I'll call it, or VG. Okay, VG square. So this is the kinetic energy associated with a particle point mass concentrated at the center of mass of this rigid body. Okay, in addition to that, there is a kinetic energy associated with rotational motion. So this captures the kinetic energy associated with translation. Then there's a kinetic energy associated with rotation. What is that? That's half of omega. So A times B transpose is B transpose times A transpose, right? So I can write this as rho transpose. Instead of omega cross rho here, I'll write it as minus of rho cross omega, so that my simplification becomes easier later. And here also, I'll write this as rho cross minus of rho cross omega dm. Okay, so this I'll just focus on this term here. This minus times minus becomes plus, so this is just going to be equal to half of integral rho cross omega transpose times rho cross omega dm. And as I said, rho cross omega transpose is omega transpose rho transpose. So this is going to be equal to half of integral omega transpose rho cross transpose, then rho cross omega dm. I'll write this on the next page. Okay, so the kinetic energy associated with rotation alone, I'll not write T therefore, is just half of, as I'll write the same expression, omega transpose rho cross transpose rho cross omega dm. Now omega and omega transpose again do not have any spatial variation, so I just remove them from the integral. I'll get this to be half of omega transpose integral rho cross transpose rho cross dm times omega. Okay, do you recognize this term here, rho cross transpose rho cross? If you remember, rho cross is an skew symmetric matrix, right? So therefore, rho cross transpose by definition is simply minus rho cross, because rho cross is a skew symmetric matrix, and hence I would have this to be equal to half of omega transpose minus rho cross, which is rho cross square dm omega. And this, if you see, by definition is the inertia matrix, right? So half omega transpose inertia about the center of mass g times omega. So this is the kinetic energy associated with rotational motion. Okay, omega transpose Ig omega. So it's not a simple expression as not as simple an expression as what you got for translational motion. Here you will have components which are products of omega x and omega y and so on and so forth in the kinetic energy expression. Okay, any questions about this derivation? Okay, so it's straightforward algebra. So the total kinetic energy therefore is equal to half of mass times the center of mass, the square. So there are two components. If the center of mass is moving with a certain velocity, then kinetic energy is that of a particle of the same mass moving with the same velocity. But in addition to that, there is an extra term which is associated with the angular velocity with which the rigid body is rotating, and that's given by omega transpose Ig omega. Okay, so before I use this expression in a Lagrangian and then subsequently obtain equations of motion for some physical system, I want to pause briefly to examine this term here and make some comments about it. Okay. So if you notice this expression here, we have kept it free of the coordinate frame in which we are representing these quantities. I have not specified which coordinate frame it is in which I have represented omega, or it's just a coordinate frame that is attached to with its origin at the center of mass. That's all that we have said. What is its orientation? It is irrelevant, because the total kinetic energy, as I said, does not depend on the the relative orientation of the coordinate frame in which we are representing these quantities. Okay. So suppose, therefore, I choose to represent it in a very special coordinate frame, namely the principal axis of this rigid body. Then I can represent it in any coordinate system. I could represent Ig in the A system, Ig in the B system. Ig in the A system may have some time varying components, but the total kinetic energy will be the same. I can do that, but I choose to represent Ig in the principal coordinates attached to the body frame at the center of mass. In which case, I know that my Ig has a special structure, right? It will have a form of this kind: I0x, I0y, I0z. It has only diagonal entries. Okay. Now, our analysis, at the time that we introduced diagonalization of the inertia matrix, in connection with the Newton-Euler's equations, our analysis only revealed that these are real quantities. I0x, I0y, I0z are real quantities. That's all that we could conclude about as far as their properties are concerned. We couldn't say anything more. We could say that eigenvectors are orthogonal, eigenvalues are real. That was all that we could say. Now, can we say anything more about that given this expression here? Well, that is what we are out to do now. One important fact to remember, when we are, let us forget about this translational component. Let us, for the moment, set it equal to 0. Okay, so that we can focus only on the rotational component. Okay, you need to note that the kinetic energy T is always greater than 0. If omega is non-zero, then T is greater than 0. That is obvious, right? Because by definition, you're squaring the velocity and integrating that. Therefore, you can never get a negative term for kinetic energy. You will always have either, when the system is completely at rest, the kinetic energy is 0. When the system is in motion, no matter whether it's pure angular motion or pure translation or whatever, you will always have positive kinetic energy. So T is always greater than 0. Okay, such a function is called as a positive definite function. Okay, it's always greater than 0. Okay, now suppose I were to choose omega to be a vector aligned only along the x-axis. In other words, if I choose omega to be of the kind omega x 0, 0, then if I compute half omega transpose Ig omega with this particular special structure for Ig, I will get the kinetic energy for that particular case to be equal to half I0x omega x square. You just can do that math. Very simple, because omega has a simple structure and Ig also has a simple structure. If you simply multiply and obtain the expression, you will simply get it to be half I0x omega x square. Okay. Likewise, if omega were aligned only along the y-axis in the principal coordinates or aligned only along the z-axis in the principal coordinates, okay, the corresponding kinetic energies will be having only I0y term or I0z term. Okay, and we know that all these terms, I mean, these are not exactly the same. I have used the same symbol, but they are numerically they are different. They are all just kinetic energies. They all have to be greater than 0 because kinetic energy has to be greater than 0. Now, omega x square is a squared quantity, so naturally it will always be greater than 0, and that reveals another important property of the inertia matrix. Since omega x square is greater than 0 and on the left hand side I have a quantity greater than 0, I need to have the principal moments of inertia to always be greater than 0. Okay, so I0x, I0y, I0z should always be greater than 0. Okay, this is not necessarily true for a general symmetric matrix A, but for this special symmetric matrix, the inertia matrix, the principal moments of inertia, the eigenvalues of the inertia matrix are not only real, but are also always positive. They're always greater than 0. Any questions about this? Okay. So with this brief detour, brief departure from our Lagrangian formalism, let us get back to that and solve a couple of problems before we talk about multi-body dynamics. Okay. So the first example problem is that of a disk that is rolling down an inclined plane. Let the angle of that inclined plane be alpha. Okay, I have a disk which is rolling without slipping. Okay, so this is all in the vertical direction. So the question is obtain the equation of motion and also the constraint forces. Okay, so let us first consider only the equation of motion. Suppose we had to only obtain the equation of motion and not worry about constraint forces. What would we do? Firstly, we note the kind of constraint that this has. So if let me first pick an appropriate set of generalized coordinates. So let me pick the distance along this inclined plane starting from some arbitrarily chosen origin to be one generalized coordinate, and let me indicate the angle by which this disk has rotated as the other generalized coordinate. Okay, so since the point of contact of this disk with respect to that inclined plane has to be at rest if it is rolling without slipping, we need to have therefore that y dot plus r of the disk. Any questions about this? Okay, so this is as stated a non-holonomic constraint because it is not a function of y and phi alone, but it is an integrable constraint, right? So I can integrate this and simply have y plus phi times r is a constant, and I can choose my origin in such a way that this constant can be set equal to 0. You can even have it to be non-zero constant. It will still not matter for our analysis, but for the sake of simplicity, I've set it to be equal to 0. Suppose you are not interested in the constraint forces. Okay, you just wanted the equation of motion. You only need one generalized coordinate to completely describe the configuration of the system, because the moment you specify y or phi, the other one automatically gets specified as a consequence of this constraint. Okay, we don't need two things. So what will the Lagrangian look like? The Lagrangian will have a component associated with translational motion of this object, and that's going to be equal to half the mass of this object m times the velocity, which is y dot square. And then there will be a rotational component. Note that if I choose this to be my y-axis, and let us say I choose this to be my x-axis, normal to the incline, the z-axis will be out of the plane of the paper, and the z-axis will also end up being these xyz axis will be the principal coordinates for this particular object because of cylindrical symmetry. And if I have principal coordinates and I have the angular velocity aligned along only the z-axis, because phi dot, if you see, is going to be also along the z-axis. And from our previous analysis, which I showed just a moment ago, we know that the kinetic energy, if the angular velocity is along the z-axis, the kinetic energy in the principal coordinates is simply half I0z omega z square, right? So using that expression, I can write the kinetic energy associated with rotation to be equal to half I0z phi dot square. That's it. Okay. Now I can directly replace, phi dot with I can write it in terms of y dot, because y dot plus phi dot r is equal to 0. So I can write this as plus half I0z by r square y dot square. Okay. So now I have the kinetic energy to be just this. And what is the potential energy? If the potential energy, if this is y, then I have come down in the vertical direction by y times sine alpha, right? So therefore the potential energy will be equal to minus mg y sine alpha. Okay, so the Lagrangian therefore will be equal to kinetic energy minus potential energy. So minus of this will be the potential energy term. In other words, it will be equal to plus mg y sine alpha. Okay, so the physics of the problem ends here. If we are only interested in obtaining the equation of motion, and that equation ends up being something like this. y double dot. For a solid disk, it will be 2/3 g sine alpha. That's it. Okay, it will come down with it will accelerate, come down with uniform constant acceleration, and that acceleration will be equal to 2/3 g sine alpha. So if this was simply a particle, it would have accelerated down. You know, you have done such problems in your 11th standard and 12th standard. It will have accelerated down at the rate g sine alpha. But because there's also a rotational motion involved, the acceleration will not be exactly g sine alpha, but 2/3 of it. Okay. The second part of the problem. So you have already seen here how I have avoided doing the math. Okay. From this point here, after writing the Lagrangian to obtaining this differential equation, is a machinery of the Euler-Lagrange equation, which is simply math. Okay. That equation, you take partial derivatives with respect to y dot, and then with respect to y, and etc. etc. If you do that, you get this. So in future, what I shall do in other problems that I would discuss in today's lecture also is adopt the same approach. Given that is straightforward, standard, boring algebra, I will not work it out. What is not obvious or sometimes is the physics of the problem. So I shall therefore work out the Lagrangian and the constraints if there are any, and subsequently write down the equation of motion directly. Okay. Likewise, the second part of this problem, if you are asked to obtain the constraint forces, what constraint forces are there here? So there is a frictional force here, okay, which results in rotation, which ensures that this, which results in rolling motion, which ensures that the point of contact is instantaneously at rest. Okay, so how do we determine the constraint forces? So if we follow the same steps that I outlined earlier, first we write down the Lagrangian, assuming that there are no constraints. So Lagrangian will be the same as what we had before, m y dot square plus half I0 z phi dot square. Okay. Now it is assumed that y dot and phi dot are independent of one another at the time of writing down the Lagrangian. Okay. We don't assume that the two are connected by a constraint equation. Okay. Then the potential energy, of course, will continue to be mgy sine alpha, because this rotational motion doesn't contribute to any change in the potential energy expression, right? Then there is a constraint equation y plus phi r equal to 0, which is of the kind f of y comma phi equal to 0. So our function f of y comma phi is y plus phi r, right? So we define a new Lagrangian L prime equal to L plus lambda times y plus phi r. Now we treat lambda as another generalized coordinate, and then we run this whole Lagrangian through the machinery of Euler-Lagrange equations, and out comes a differential equation, a coupled differential equation. I shall write that down: my double dot minus mg sine alpha minus lambda equal to 0, and then I0 z theta double dot minus lambda r equal to 0, subject to the constraint that y plus phi r equal to 0. And if you use this expression, plug it here and eliminate lambda from your equations, you can obtain the equation of motion as before. But if you determine lambda in the process of that elimination, you can use that to obtain the joint, the constraint forces. So Qy will be by definition equal to lambda delta f by delta y. It's going to be simply equal to lambda, because f is simply y plus phi r, right? Q phi is lambda delta f by delta phi, which is basically lambda delta of y plus phi r by delta phi is equal to lambda r. Okay. Now, if you solve for, as I said, if you eliminate lambda in this process, you get lambda to be equal to g by 3, mg by 3. Okay. So you would have therefore the frictional force that ensures rolling motion to be equal to mg by 3, and the associated moment to simply be equal to r times mg by 3 as expected. Okay. So here is an example of a rigid body, a very simple example where a rigid body is rolling down an incline, and you have obtained the equations of motion, and also as a bonus the constraint forces in this problem. Any questions about the way we have gone about solving this problem? Rishikesh has a question.
Sir, means the axis we have considered for calculating moment of inertia, orientation of those axes will not change with time. Means XY
Will they
zero
change?
axis.
So if you see here, these XY axes, will they rotate? Yes. So the X, if this is a body fixed coordinate system, if this is XB and YB, as this this coin or the disc rotates, will they change their orientation? Of course they will, right? But will that change the expression for kinetic energy? Because you see it's dependent on phi dot square, and that will that's not dependent on that doesn't component and the y component, and you see that the z axis does not change its orientation. So this remains as it is. Okay.
Okay. Yes.
So these axes will definitely change their orientation as the disk rolls down. Definitely that will happen, but that will not change the expression for kinetic energy associated with rotation.
Yes. Okay.
Any other question? Okay. If not, then let us now take up a slightly more difficult, not a difficult problem, slightly more involved problem, because the machinery of Lagrangian formalism is quite straightforward. It's just that if you have a multi-body system, you inevitably end up with large equations for the equations of motion. Okay, so this is a 2R planar manipulator. This is also discussed in Professor Ghoshaal's book. So you have one revolute joint connecting the first rigid body, which is modeled as a slender beam. It need not be a slender beam, it could be anything else also. And then you have another revolute joint, okay, and then a second rigid body. So this is you just have two revolute joints. So it's a manipulator with 2 degrees of freedom, okay, and it is operating in the vertical plane. So let us attach some variables to describe its configuration. So θ1, the angle that the first link makes with the ground, and θ2, the angle that the second link makes with the first link, are 2 variables which can help to completely define the configuration of this 2R manipulator. So we can choose our generalized coordinates to be θ1 and θ2. Q1 is θ1, Q2 is θ2. Okay. Now these manipulators have certain properties associated with them. These links have certain properties. The first one has a length L1 and mass m1, and moment of inertia for rotation about the out of plane axis I1. Okay, and the other one has length L2, m2, and I2. Okay, so obtain the equations of motion, not the constraint forces in this particular case, just the equations of motion. That's the problem that we would be solving now. So as before, the approach that I would adopt is to not solve all the algebra in its entirety and set your heads spinning. I will just capture the physics here. Okay, I will just write down the equations that are necessary to obtain the Lagrangian, then write down the Lagrangian, and from there in one shot, I will assume that you have the equipment to solve the Euler-Lagrange equations, not solve. Obtain the Euler-Lagrange equations, and then I will write down the equations of motion in one shot. That's the approach that I would adopt. Okay, so we need to define the Lagrangian, and that's going to be equal to sum of the kinetic energy minus the potential energy. And the total kinetic energy of the system is the kinetic energy of the first link plus the kinetic energy of the second link. And the potential energy likewise is the potential energy of the first link plus the potential energy of the second link. Okay, assuming that these are slender rods, okay, and they're symmetric, their center of mass can be assumed to be at their geometric center. In Professor Goshal's book, he has considered a more general case where that may not be true. Here, for the sake of simplicity, I'm considering the situation where the center of mass of this first rigid body is situated at the center, at the geometric center of this body. Okay, what will the simpler ones here to determine are the potential energies V1 and V2. So V1 would be simply equal to m1. Okay, the height of the center of mass above the ground is, if you notice, L1 by 2 times sine theta 1. Okay, times G. That's the potential energy for the first link. That's it. Okay, the potential energy for the second link, it requires us to compute, the height of the center of mass of that second link from the ground. And if you see, it's the height of the first joint from the ground plus the height of the center of mass from the first joint. So height of the first joint from the ground will be L1 sine theta 1. So that plus L2 by 2 sine of the absolute orientation of the second link with respect to the ground is theta 1 plus theta 2. So sine of theta 1 plus theta 2 will be the total height of the center of mass of the second rigid body from the ground. Okay, this times m2 times G is going to be the potential energy associated with the second rigid body here. Any questions so far? Okay, now as far as kinetic energy is concerned, that's a little bit more involved, although still quite routine because we have done such kinematic analyses before. If you consider the first link, okay, the center of mass is at the middle, so I'll call that as PCM, P1 cm. Okay, so if this angle is theta 1 and it is changing at the rate theta 1 dot, then what is the x component of velocity of the center of mass? It's going to be equal to L1 by 2 times minus L1 by 2 times sine theta 1 times theta 1 dot. Okay, and the y component will be equal to plus L1 by 2 cos theta 1 dot. Okay, if you are a little mystified about how I got this expression, you can take one further step back. Okay, you can write down the x component of the center of mass P1 cm x to be equal to L1 by 2 sine theta cos theta 1 and P1 cm y to be equal to L1 by 2 sine theta 1 and differentiate those two to get the corresponding velocities. Okay, that can also be done if you want to take one step back. But ultimately, it boils down to understanding the kinematics of the problem correctly. Okay, what about the second, the velocity of the rigid body? Okay, this is the linear velocity. What is the angular velocity? Omega. It will be about the z-axis, and it will be equal to omega z equal to simply theta 1 dot. That is angular velocity, right? Likewise, for the second link, okay, what is the location P2 cm? What is that equal to? P2 cm, if you see, the x component of that is the x component of, it's going to be equal to L1 cos theta 1 plus L2 by 2 cos theta 1 plus theta 2. That's the x component. The y component will be L1 sine theta 1 plus L2 by 2 sine of theta 1 plus theta 2. Again, from simple kinematics, from the geometry of the problem. Okay, so the velocity of the center of mass, therefore, will be equal to L1 cos theta 1. Sorry, if I differentiate both these things, then it will be of the kind L1 minus L1 sine theta 1 dot minus L2 by 2 sine theta 1 plus theta 2 theta 1 dot plus theta 2 dot, right? And likewise, the bottom, the second entries will be L minus plus L1 cos theta 1 dot plus L2 by 2 cos of theta 1 plus theta 2 times theta 1 dot plus theta 2 dot. Right? Any questions about this? Okay. So what is therefore the total kinetic energy? The total kinetic energy will be equal to half of the first mass m1 times the velocity of its center of mass square. So that's going to be equal to v1x square plus v1y square. That's associated with translational motion of that first rigid body, and then there will be the kinetic energy with its rotation I0z, or in this case it is call it I1 times theta 1 dot square. So this is the total kinetic energy associated with the first rigid body, and I'll have a similar expression for the total kinetic energy associated with the second rigid body. Okay, so I have obtained the linear velocity of the second rigid body, from which I can obtain the, or translational velocity of that rigid body, from which I can obtain the kinetic energy associated with translational motion. What is the angular velocity of the second rigid body? You see that the second rigid body is also rotating about the z-axis. So the total orientation change with respect to about the z-axis for the second link is theta 1 plus theta 2. So therefore, the angular velocity omega z1, omega z2 will simply be equal to theta 1 dot plus theta 2 dot. Net angular velocity will be the sum of the angular velocities of the first link and the second link with respect to the first link. That's it. Okay. So therefore, the kinetic energy associated with rotational motion for the second link will be half I2 times theta 1 dot square plus theta 2 dot square. Okay. And then there is the kinetic energy associated with translation, and I'll have a big expression for that. Okay. I have to substitute essentially these two terms, x component and y component. It will be L1 sine theta 1 dot plus L2 by 2 sine of theta 1 plus theta 2. I'll just compress all of this. Okay. I'm assuming that you guys understand what I'm doing, and you're not dependent on the exact things I'm writing here to follow what I'm doing here. This whole square plus the other one, L1 cos theta 1 dot plus L2 by 2 cos theta 1 plus theta 2 times theta 1 dot plus theta 2 dot, the whole square. Okay. So this is the total kinetic energy T. With this, the physics of the problem comes to its end. I have chosen the appropriate generalized coordinates. I have written down the kinematic equations, worked them out to obtain the velocities and also the positions of the center of mass. The velocities can be used to compute the kinetic energy. The positions can be used to compute the potential energy, and have done both of them. Okay. And I now run this, I define the Lagrangian as T minus V, and run this Lagrangian through the Euler-Lagrange equations to obtain the equations of motion. Any questions so far? Okay. So I will therefore, yeah, Rishikesh has a question.
Sir, can you explain that rotational kinetic energy of second link once again, please?
Rotational kinetic energy of the second link, is it? So
Yes.
what is the orientation of the second link with respect to the ground? Do you agree it's going to be theta 1 plus theta 2?
Yes.
And it's going to be rotating about the z-axis?
Yes, sir.
Therefore, the kinetic energy, therefore the angular velocity will be theta 1 dot plus theta 2 dot.
Okay.
And therefore the kinetic energy will be half, oh, this is not theta 1 dot plus theta 2 dot whole square. I'm sorry.
That's why I got confused.
It's not theta 1 dot plus theta 2. You are absolutely right. Thank you for pointing it out. Theta 1 dot plus theta 2 dot whole square. Okay.
Okay.
Any other questions? Thanks a lot for pointing it out. Okay. So now, in one shot we can obtain the equations of motion. Notice in this case that despite, of course, the apparent complexity, you expect the procedure to be lengthy. simply because you are dealing with multiple rigid bodies here. But compare the simplicity of this approach with what you would have had to do if you had adopted Newton-Euler formulation. Firstly, you have to represent all of these in their respective body coordinate systems. Okay, here I have represented all these variables with respect to the ground reference frame. You had to, in that case, represent them in their body coordinates. Secondly, you cannot stop with just obtaining velocity relationships. You have to go one step further, obtain the angular acceleration and angular velocity as well for each of these. Angular acceleration, angular velocity, linear acceleration. All of that has to be obtained. Then you have to define, reaction forces at this joint, at the other joint, and so on. Then you have to represent the reaction forces in the right coordinate system. And then you have to write down the Newton-Euler equations. So these are the steps that you would need to follow. Okay. Compared to that, you see, all we needed to do was compute the positions and velocities. That's it. And with that, I had all the information necessary to obtain the kinetic energy and the potential energy. Now, I simply run this through the machinery of Newton-Euler equations, Euler-Lagrange equations, and obtain the dynamics. I'm going to write down the equations next. Okay. You have to solve a lot of algebra. You can use some symbolic math software like Maple or Mathematica to do this for you. But here I'm writing down the final expression. It looks very messy. I'll write down in the matrix form. Okay, there will be two generalized coordinates, right? θ1 and θ2. So there will be two equations. I'll put these two equations together and represent them in a matrix form. Okay, so the first equation has a huge matrix multiplying θ1 double dot and θ2 double dot. Okay, and that matrix, I'll write down the entries of the matrix here one by one. It's I1 plus I2 plus M1 L1 square plus M2 L2 square by 4 plus M1 L1 square by 4 plus 2 M2 L1 L2 cos θ2. The second term is I2, okay, plus M2 L2 square by 4. I mean, you don't need to very religiously read my lips or follow what I'm saying and write it down. It is something that you can do yourself if you just sit down and have the patience to simplify those, write down, solve, obtain the expressions for delta L by delta theta dot and so on. Plus M2 L1 L2 by 2 cos θ2. Okay, then I2 plus M2 L2 square by 4 plus M2 L1 L2 by 2 cos θ2. And the last term is I2 plus M2 L2 square by 4. Okay, this is multiplying the acceleration terms plus minus M2 L1 L2 by 2 sin θ2 times 2 θ1 dot θ2 dot plus θ2 dot square and M2 L1 L2 sin θ2 times θ1 dot square plus, then there is a term that you would get by taking the partial derivative of Lagrangian with respect to the joint coordinates or generalized coordinates themselves. From that you get M2G L1 cos θ1 plus L2 cos of θ1 plus θ2 plus M1G L1 by 2 cos θ1, and this is M2G L2 by 2 cos θ1 plus θ2, and that's going to be equal to the joint torques τ1 and τ2. I don't know if I defined the joint torques in the example. When I gave the example, I shall write it, retroactively I'll introduce that. Suppose there's a motor here that can apply torque τ1 at the first joint and torque τ2 at the second joint. Then we know from a principle of virtual work that if I provide a certain provide a certain virtual displacement delta θ1, the work done will be τ1 times delta θ1. So the first generalized and the work done by τ2 will be 0. Okay, so the first generalized force will simply be equal to tau 1. Likewise, when I perturb delta theta 2, tau 1 will not do any work, only tau 2 will do work, will do virtual work, and therefore the second generalized force will be tau 2. Okay, that I should have ideally indicated that. That was part of the steps that I had outlined a few minutes back. I'm sorry, I forgot to finish discussion of the physics of the problem. I shall write that here. Q theta 1 is equal to tau 1, Q theta 2 is equal to tau 2. Okay, so with those additions, I can now write down the equations of motion, and they look something like this. Any questions? Okay, so the first thing that should come to your mind when you look at this is, damn, this is messy. And it is indeed so. Okay, even for something as simple as a 2R planar manipulator, look at how complicated the expression appears. Okay, so imagine how much, how many of these similar symbols we would need to plot through if we had chosen to use Newton-Euler formulation and did not have Lagrange formalism available to us. For a general n-link manipulator, imagine how much more difficult it would have been for us to simplify expressions and so on. Even with the machinery that helps us to simplify it, we end up with such a complicated looking equation that relates the generalized coordinates, in this case the joint variables theta 1, theta 2 and their derivatives, to the torque. Okay, so it looks complicated. That's the first note. Can we make any physical sense of the of some of the terms here? Well, if you look at, for example, m2g L2 by 2 cos theta 1 plus theta 2, that could be interpreted as a torque applied by that force m2g that's acting at the center of mass, the torque applied by that at the first joint, sorry, at the second joint. So that could be the interpretation of that. Similarly, this other term, the first term here, can be interpreted as a torque applied by the weights of both the links, about the first joint. And geometrically, you can see that L1 cos theta 1 and L2 cos theta 1 plus theta 2, etc., has to appear as a consequence of that. So these terms, therefore, complicated though they appear, have a very clearly understood physical meaning. Okay, they define the torques applied by the weights about the two joints, the first joint and the second joint. The first term is for the first joint, the second term is for the second joint. Okay, what about these terms here? Well, if you see this term here, you have theta 1 dot square, right? So this term, therefore, has got to do with centripetal acceleration, right? So this second term, therefore, here is due to centripetal acceleration of this mass m2. Okay, and on the top you have theta 2 dot square and theta 1 dot theta 2 dot. Theta 2 dot square again is associated with centripetal acceleration. What about theta 1 dot theta 2 dot? Well, theta 1 dot theta 2 dot, if you recollect, we have had these kinds of discussions in the past in connection with the swash plate. Such terms appear in connection with Coriolis forces, right? So therefore, the second complicated term also has a physical interpretation. The bottom ones are due to centripetal forces, the torques applied by centripetal force. Okay, both the term at the top and the term at the bottom are due to centripetal and Coriolis forces. Okay, then you have the inertia matrix, which is associated with theta double dot. Okay, I cannot breathe too much physical intuition into this, okay, except to point out that if you compute the moment of inertia matrix about the first if you simplify the overall equation, let us say starting with Newton-Euler's equations, you will end up with an overall inertia matrix that looks like this. The only point that I wish to make in connection with this is the fact that the inertia matrix is symmetric. if you see the off-diagonal terms, they are identical in their appearance, and that is a more generally applicable fact, and we can also show that more rigorously. This term in particular, maybe you can understand it somewhat. You have used parallel axis theorem in some way to get I2 plus M2 L2 square by 4 to represent the moment of inertia for rotations about the second second joint, right? So similar application of parallel axis theorems gives you the other terms, but beyond that, I am not in a position to breathe any physical life into the matrix that you have multiplying the acceleration terms. So any questions so far? So although this looks complicated, so this is torque due to gravity, we can clearly at a qualitative level understand each of these three terms. Okay, torque due to gravity. Of course, it has the units of torque because we have chosen θ1 and θ2 to be generalized coordinates. If you had a prismatic joint instead of a revolute joint, then one of the generalized forces will not be a torque, it will be an actual force, in which case we should not use the word torque. Okay, so maybe we can replace this with generalized force or some such thing. Okay, then this is centripetal and Coriolis terms. Okay, and this is inertia. There's a name for this matrix. It's called as a mass matrix. Okay, we will revisit them soon. Of course, we don't have too much time in today's class, but we will revisit them when we obtain the equations of motion for a more general n-link manipulator. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so now that we have done this for a two-link manipulator, the question now, we are now taking on the problem that we really set out to take down to solve, namely obtaining the equations of motion for an n-link manipulator. As you can expect, the equations will be very, you'll have very complicated in appearance. Okay, although with some intuition you will be able to relate to the terms, it will be complicated in appearance. The goal here is not so much to obtain the exact structure of these equations. We can do it if you know the machinery, but rather to talk about the approach that one would adopt to obtain these equations. Okay, that is more important to me than actually solving. See, once we obtain the Lagrangian, that's the end of that. Okay, I shall write down the final answer, and I will not talk about how you get the final answer, and I will not also discuss, I will not do the intermediate steps and so on. The point, the more important point in this entire discussion is that you can, in one shot, obtain the dynamics of a multi-link, multi-body system by using Lagrangian formalism, whereas you will be mired with algebra complexities if you use Newton-Euler formalism. Okay, that is the central point. So what I shall do therefore is show you how to obtain the Lagrangian for a multi-body system, and then simply write down the structure of the equation of motion. That's it. I will stop with that. Okay. I may not be able to complete this entire thing in today's lecture. If I run out of time, I will continue, pick up from where I left off in the next lecture. So let us consider a serial kinematic chain. As we discussed, this is the kind of chain that we would be focused on account of its comparative simplicity as far as forward kinematics is concerned. Okay, so you have some n links. Okay, so how do we obtain the equations of motion for a n-link serial kinematic chain? So this was what caused us so much trouble, if you simply used Newton-Euler formulation, and therefore this is the problem that we are most interested to solve using Lagrangian formalism. Okay. So the first step is to identify the generalized coordinates. Okay. So the most natural generalized coordinates are the joint variables. So I shall take theta 1, and I shall assume for the sake of generality that the second joint is not really a revolute joint, but perhaps a prismatic joint. Otherwise, we'll keep using thetas, and we will not talk about generalized coordinate. Call this as D2, okay? And then maybe the third one may be a revolute joint again, so theta 3, etc., etc. Just to throw in this fact that we are not focused only on revolute joints, I have introduced a prismatic joint as the second link. Okay, so the generalized coordinates, you have n joints and n revolute joints, and you have therefore n degrees of freedom for this. So I need n generalized coordinates to capture the configuration of a serial kinematic chain. I'll therefore choose Q1 to be theta 1, Q2 to be theta 2, D2, sorry, Q3 to be theta 3, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, I need to obtain the total kinetic energy in terms of Q1, Q2, etc. up to Qn and their rates of change, Q1 dot, Q2 dot, etc. And I need to obtain the total potential energy again in terms of Q1 to Qn. Potential energy will not depend on the rates of change of joint variables. Joint velocities will not feature in the potential energy expression. With this, I can obtain the Lagrangian, and then from there I can obtain the equations of motion. So these are the steps. So I have to obtain the potential energy, I have to obtain the kinetic energy, and then the then the Lagrangian. Okay, so the expression for potential energy is fairly straightforward as before. Okay, so if I solve the if I given theta 1 and D2 and so on, if I do the forward kinematic analysis, I can obtain the locations of the centers of mass of each of these links, each of these rigid bodies. So if the ith rigid body center of mass is PCM, PI comma CM, I don't know if I use PCMI or PI comma CM in the past, and I represent that in the 0th coordinate system. Okay, therefore I know what its values are in the 0th coordinate system. Then the potential energy is given by minus m g vector again represented in the 0th coordinate system transpose times the position vector. Okay, so this will give me where the g vector is given by 0, 0, minus g. Okay, so mgh is the correct expression. I have written that height in terms of this particular as a dot product of these two vectors, g times the height as a dot product of these two vectors, and this is the potential energy of the ith rigid body. Any questions about this? Okay, that's good to know that there are no questions. So the total potential energy therefore is equal to sigma Vi. And now the position of that ith center of mass will be a function of the joint variables up to the ith joint, right? So this will be a function of theta 1, T2, etc., etc. Or in other words, it will be a function of Q1, Q2, all the way up to Qi. Any questions again about this? Okay, so the position vector of that nth center of mass will depend on all the joint variables, or in other words, all the generalized coordinates. The position of the first center of mass will depend only on theta 1 or Q1, the first generalized coordinate, and so on and so forth. But the total kinetic potential energy, when I sum over all of these, will therefore in general be a function of all the n generalized coordinates. The next is to compute the kinetic energy. Okay, so kinetic energy T is again is going to be equal to the sum of the kinetic energies of each of these rigid bodies, or in other words, it's going to be equal to sigma Ti. Right? So now, let us take a general ith rigid body, and the location of center of mass is Pi comma Cm. I don't know if I used PCMI in the past. If I have, then please read this as PCMI. Okay, doesn't matter. If there is some abuse of notation, maybe I'll correct it after I examine what I've written in the past. What is the kinetic energy associated with this? I'll call that T subscript I. Okay, that is equal to half of the mass of this, which is mi, times the velocity of this. The velocity, the absolute velocity of this, not the relative velocity. So that's going to be equal to V, okay, Cm, Vi comma Cm or Vcm comma I, Vi Cm, okay, square. Whether this absolute velocity is represented in the body coordinates or in the inertial coordinates is irrelevant, as we discussed, because the magnitude of this vector will remain the same. Maybe I will put magnitude, correct, not just V square, magnitude of that vector square. Okay, plus half omega I transpose I gi. Okay, I gi is the moment of inertia matrix about the center of mass of the ith rigid body times omega I. Okay, so this is the expression, and I shall simplify this one step. Right, this is half of mi times Vicm transpose Vicm plus half omega I transpose Igi omega I. This is the kinetic energy for a single rigid body, and a general ith rigid body in this kinematic chain. Now we will have n minus 1 other such expressions, so totally n expressions. So as has been a a constant secondary theme in our course, we have always sought ways to simplify appearance of expressions. So if I were to write down the expression for the kinetic energy as a sum of all of these things, it will look extremely messy. Okay, so therefore what I would be doing next is to find a way to cast the expression for the kinetic energy in a simple form. Okay, fortunately it turns out that I don't need anything more than vectors and matrices to do that. I don't need to invent or take the help of a new mathematical machinery to package away the complexity in the expression for the total kinetic energy. I can use matrices itself to do it. So we shall do that next before we write down the kinetic energy for the overall system. Okay. Once we are done with that, you see all of these are just linear translational velocities and angular velocities. We have to relate them to the joint variables or the generalized coordinates, and then express the kinetic energy in terms of the generalized coordinates. Just as we have expressed potential energy in terms of generalized coordinates, we have to express kinetic energy also in terms of generalized coordinates. Once we are done with that, we have a Lagrangian which is fully defined for our problem, and then we can use it to obtain the Euler-Lagrange equations of motion. Okay, so these are the steps that remain for us to do, and it is already rather late right now, so I shall do this in the next class. Undertake these steps in the next class. Any questions so far? Okay, so if there are no questions, then you can also ask me questions pertaining to other material stuff that I taught in the previous class or the classes before that. As we discussed, we will have 2 sessions, some 15 minutes or 10 minutes before the class starts, and some 10-15 minutes after the class is finished, to discuss any questions you might have. So those who want to discuss such questions are welcome to stay back and ask me those questions. Others can probably take off. The lectures will anyway be recorded. You can listen to those questions later. It's up to you. Yeah, Rajpal Singh has a question.
So actually I have a question regarding the spinning source plate. So in the final expression of the spinning source plate, where we derived the moment or applied the Euler equation, we simply use the cross product matrix as omega z, but shouldn't it be the total angular velocity omega z plus omega s represented in the B1 frame?
Omega z plus omega, no. See, what we did, if you remember, the arguments are not any different compared to what we had for a spinning swash plate about the a swash plate spinning about the axis. Are you talking about the top problem, the heavy top problem, or are you talking about the swash plate itself?
So the swash plate itself, the spinning swash plate.
Okay. So the center of mass is therefore along the axis of the axis of rotation, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So you had, so we were resolving the components of all these vectors in the B1 coordinate system. Okay. The B1 coordinate system, you have two vectors. One is omega s vector, which is aligned along the B axis, and the omega z vector, which is aligned along the ZB1 axis. Okay, the z axis of the B1 coordinate system. The other vector is aligned along the z axis of the B coordinate system. Right? Correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, then we computed the angular momentum. And the angular momentum also turned out to be fixed. Even though this guy was spinning about the ZB coordinate, ZB axis, the direction of angular momentum was not changing in the B1 coordinate system. Okay, that angular momentum associated with spin was aligned along the B axis of the aligned along the B axis, which is also the B2 Z. Sorry, it is aligned along the ZB2 axis, which is also the same as ZB axis. Correct?
Actually,
Hello?
Sir, in ZB2 axis we shifted it by theta, so ZB2 and ZB1 are not the same.
Correct. That's why I'm saying that this angular momentum associated with spin was aligned along the ZB2 axis. Do you agree with me on that?
Yes, sir, it was aligned along the ZB1 axis.
ZB2 axis, the angular momentum associated with spin.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now the angular momentum associated with this precision, this rotation about ZB1 axis, had an x component as well as a z component, right?
Yes, sir.
But at the end of the day, when I added all these vectors, I ended up with a total angular momentum vector which had a certain x component and a certain z component in the B1 coordinate system, neither of which were changing with time. You agree with me?
Yes, sir.
Now I am rotating this overall angular momentum about the z axis by at a rate omega z, because the B1 coordinate system is rotating about the about the inertial coordinate frame at a rate omega z, right?
Yes, sir.
Therefore, to compute the rate of change of angular momentum, I should simply do omega z cross of the actual angular momentum vector, which was a fixed vector in the B1 coordinate system. So you won't have omega s plus omega z, you will only have omega z.
So that's true, but sir, if we talk about simply applying the Euler equation to that frame, not if we don't know about the.
If you want to apply Euler's equations, we did that also, right? We took the case of the if you want to apply Euler's equations, firstly you note that the B1 frame and the B2 frame are not the body fixed frames. Okay, the body fixed frame is the frame that is rotating along with the rigid body, right? So we did it for the case of the symmetric top. Okay, in which case angular velocities will themselves, the components of angular velocities will themselves be functions of time. Okay, you can do that, and therefore the even the moments I think that you would have would also be functions of time. You could do that, you could apply it, and you will end up with the same kind of results. For the sake of simplicity, however, I carefully chose the frame in which to represent these quantities. Okay, if you chose the body fixed frame, for example, the angular momentum vector will again have a constant component and a component that is rotating about the x-axis in the body fixed frame. I don't know if it will have a component that will rotate. It will have x and y components, both of which changing with time. Okay, and then there will be a differential equation that you have to solve in order to obtain the relationship between the rates of change of those components and the moments that are acting on the system. You can do that as well. It's just that it requires you to solve a differential equation to get the answer, get the reaction forces. That's it.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Yeah, you can do that, but there is. I have explained to you why I only did omega z cross. That was because I was working always in the B1 reference frame. I was representing all in the B1 reference frame. That was why I only did omega z cross.
Okay, sir.
Rushikesh has a question.
Sir, regarding this problem only, means while we were calculating reaction forces on bearings,
Huh.
sir, at that time, sir, means when we write summation of moments equals to this our means from matrix components.
Huh.
So, sir, while we can means write summation of m means in terms of forces into means r cross f.
Huh.
Sir, there's a direction I am a bit confused. In which direction that forces acts?
The force. So again, if you are talking about a swash plate problem, the moments will always be along the y-axis of the B1 reference frame.
Yes, that I got. Sir.
Huh? So
So,
what
sir,
was your
this
question?
sir, this moment should be balanced by forces. Means that if we assume that means along y-axis these moments are acting means clockwise.
Yes. So
So,
see, if you compute omega cross h, okay, if you compute the rate of change of angular momentum for that problem, it will have only a y component. Okay.
yes.
So
Yes.
therefore, whatever reaction forces you have at the bearings should result in a moment only which has also only a y component.
Yes.
Okay, which will confine you to looking, which will constrain the reaction forces to have only an x component.
Yes.
Okay, because the position vectors have z components alone, the reaction forces should therefore only have x component, so that their cross product will have only y component.
Yes.
Okay, so what else was your question? What was confusing about this?
Sir, means sir, means if we assume that due to this omega cross I omega moment is clockwise, then forces should result in anti-clockwise moment to balance this out.
No. I mean, on one side of the equation, you have omega cross I omega.
Yes.
And that equals to something on the other side of the equation, r cross f.
Okay.
So if on the left-hand side I have a clockwise, you don't talk of clockwise, anti-clockwise, because these are vectors along certain axes, right? Omega cross I omega, let us say, is along the positive y-axis.
Okay.
Then on the right-hand side also, you have a moment along the positive y-axis.
Okay.
They should not be opposite or something. They should be equal. They should be the same direction.
Okay.
Because they appear on either, on either sides of an equation.
Okay. Got it, sir.
Any other question? Okay. There seem to be no further questions. So in that case, we shall wrap up today's lecture. So I shall see you guys again this Thursday. Thanks a lot.